Hello and good afternoon. I'm John Kadous, Vice President and Head of Products here at AAIS, and welcome to the final session of the Pulse for this week. This session is cyber, fire, and flood, the triple threat facing homeowners. And I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion that we've got with our participants. So let me jump right in by announcing, or I should say, giving a little bit of background about our participants as we introduce them. So first is Jeff Cron. Jeff is Senior Vice President of Cyber and Product Development at Berkley Re Solutions. Jeff oversees the management of cyber liability, both commercial and personal, as well as product development. Jeff's responsibilities include oversight of cyber liability and the development of custom turnkey solutions and new products. Jeff specializes in the tailoring of solutions to meet specific customer needs, as well as providing logistical support for customer implementation and management strategies. Welcome, Jeff.
Thanks, John.
Next is Serena Garahan. Serena is Vice President, Inland Flood Product Manager for Munich Re America Inc., Munich Re US, as we like to call them. And Serena is responsible for the oversight of the inland flood coverage endorsement. In her current role, Serena works closely with partner carriers to implement the inland flood endorsement, providing support for filing, marketing, and training. Prior to this, she worked in the reinsurance claims department at Munich Re US, handling liability and property claims. And last, but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce AAIS's own Dr. Matt Heinz Aldrich. Matt is Fire Peril Risk Strategy Lead at AAIS. He has led a number of national initiatives and projects to improve how fire departments collect, analyze, and use data to focus their efforts, improve their operations, and demonstrate their value. At AAIS, he helps lead the development, expansion, and adoption of the FLAMES, Fire Loss and Mitigation Evaluation Score, methodology for insurers to assess local fire protection and mitigation efforts. So, as we prepare to dive in, I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of background. You know, why would we pick fire, cyber, and flood? Well, every day we see headlines about massive cyber breaches, catastrophic wildfires, or floods. These events generate a lot of awareness of catastrophe events, but most homeowners, fortunately, don't experience these massive events. Nonetheless, understanding what risks they do face is critically important if they're going to address it. Also, we recently surveyed our members who are active in the personal line space. What are they most interested in pursuing, or maybe they're even already starting to venture into that? Well, of course, you're probably already doing something with fire. So, looking at the survey, the top two answers that they gave us were actually family cyber and inland flood. 70% actually are interested in family cyber, and a little over half also for inland flood. So terrific interest in the programs that we're going to be speaking about today. So Jeff, speaking of current events and some of the big events that we see out there, publicized. Last week we heard about Pandora Papers, and we've had, oh gosh, I don't even know how many of these major events that have popped on the screen over the course of just the last year. Well, Pandora Papers probably doesn't directly impact anybody who is watching this session, but nonetheless, it grabbed a lot of attention. So Jeff, does the average homeowner have to worry about such attacks?
Yeah, John, great question. And, thanks for letting me join today. The Pandora Papers, they certainly made major headlines. And as a quick backdrop to that, right, the Pandora Papers was a massive trove of information on politicians, celebrities, business leaders, and really all of their financial dealings. For this purpose, I think we'll assume that it was purely a breach, right? Not any leaked information or anything like that. So, most homeowners probably don't need to worry about this type of scenario because most homeowners don't have loads of money hidden offshore and shell companies helping them do that. But the underlying concern or the underlying risk here should be getting everyone's attention. These are heads of states, presidents, celebrities, business leaders, right, who had sophisticated systems and protections in place. And they were able to have their documents accessed. So more likely than not, I think the average person has to believe that their information is at a minimum accessible to any bad actor who really wants to get after it. The typical homeowner information is not going to be as juicy, right, as the stuff that would have been in these papers, but it's still private to them and something that they're not going to want freely accessible on the web. So, long story short, yes, homeowners should be concerned about how easily their information could be accessed. And really, we've seen this many times already, right? There's been large credit bureaus hacked, major retailers, large hospital systems, all hacked and exposed your personal information. I think, unfortunately, it's going to happen again and again. So yes, worry about your information, but you probably don't need to worry about being part of a, global news alert.
So that is both, good on the one hand, don't have to worry about probably being swept into Pandora Papers kind of thing. But on the other hand, yes, your information is out there, not necessarily readily available to anybody who wants it, but your information is out there and it is susceptible.
Absolutely.
So, I think one of the myths of cyber attacks is that people perceive that those really focus on governmental entities and on big business. So do you agree, or are typical homeowners actually more aware of the risk than I suspect they are?
Yeah, I think governments and big businesses, right, they make better headlines. The dollars are bigger, there's been more records exposed, and people in general can relate to and understand who these organizations are and why they were targeted. That said, homeowners are at risk, right? And they need to be aware of what's out there. I think traditionally we used to think of homeowners and we would think of identity theft, right? That was the risk that you faced and it was there and you had protection for it. But now we really need to shift that and think of it as homeowners and identity theft plus extortion, plus system compromise, plus social engineering scams and cyberbullying. Because what's become here is cyber is a spectrum of risks facing homeowners today. And the data is telling us that those risks are growing every year. So if you were to kind of break that down and look at some of the reports that are available, 2020 saw $4.2 billion of cybercrime loss, which was up from $3.5 billion in 2019. Complaints of cybercrime are growing right alongside of that. Nearly 800,000 complaints in 2020, up from 467,000 in 2019. So you kind of break that down, right? It's a little over $5,000 per cybercrime, which is a very real expense to homeowners, right? So bad actors are very, very skilled at taking advantage of the moment. Things like job opportunity fraud, which is, over $3,700 per scam this year. Because what's happening is, right, the bad actors evolve with the current events too, and they just find new ways to come after you.
All right, thank you for that. And one other, well, I guess I'm kind of curious. So yes, the ones that everybody sees are the ones that occur on a large scale, big business, governmental entities, and people tend to be more aware of those and don't understand their own risk all the time. So when you look at that misconception about government and big business, what other misconceptions are out there? What other kind of similar beliefs do homeowners have about the safety of, or I should say, their exposure or lack thereof to cybercrime?
This one is interesting because I think what you get, the typical response is always, well, this isn't going to happen to me. I can spot the scam. I've seen this before. Over the last 5 years or so, I would tell people that the data is only further proof that cybercrime doesn't discriminate because the demographic breakdown showed you that, right? If you looked at the age breakdown of all the victims, the younger brackets, so 30 to 39 and 40 to 49, they were falling victim more often than those in the over 60 bucket. Again, right? So no age discrimination, just bad actors in a hot pursuit of money. This past year, 2020, we saw some different trends kind of going on in the reports, right? And I think the details behind this are important. The data showed a significant increase in folks over 60 falling victim to cybercrime. And what changed, right? What changed over last year that leads to this? Well, obviously the pandemic hits, people have stayed indoors, they couldn't see their family, and that led to a rise in technology and a rise in social media usage by that older generation, right? So folks over 60. So that coupled with exploding cybercrime, geared at taking advantage of our need to consume information, right? Have all the latest material, the information, the vaccine, whatever it was going to be related to COVID, we had to consume it right away. And bad actors knew that they could prey on that kind of information demand. And what did it lead to, right? It led to more crime. And, just kind of sticking on that trend, just to name a few, right? So tech support fraud was $38 million in 2019, up to $116 million in 2020. Confidence and romance schemes went up over $50 million in 2020. So what this really all boils down to is the fact that everyone is a target and everyone can be fooled or be breached or be a victim of cyberbullying. That misconception that it's not going to happen to me or I'm smart enough to know better just isn't the case. And the reality is what everyone needs to keep in mind is that these bad actors just spent the last, year, 2 years learning a ton about our behaviors. They watched us consume this information. They learned how to stay current. They learned how to target us. And it doesn't need to be COVID, right? It can just be the next big current event that we all have to consume information on. And that will be the next thing that they take advantage of.
So what are some of the more current types of cyber-related issues that face the average homeowner? And have those been the same over the period of, say, the last 5 years, or are those kind of evolving as new approaches tend to catch people more by surprise?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I think it's evolving or maybe just adding to, because I don't think the original issues are going away, right? So the common items, the basics, right? Identity theft or system compromise, right? By that we mean malware on your computer. They're still there. They're not going away. But more and more, particularly I think in terms of the interest and concern about things we're seeing more, hearing more, getting more questions about, it's really conversations focused around cyberbullying and social engineering, right? These are both becoming more common, more costly, and really more importantly, they're more emotional events for the insured. And they need to be dealt with quickly and also in the best way to make an insured whole again, right? Bullying rates are through the roof and kids can't escape that just because they left the classroom, right? They're always connected now. And giving parents resources, how to handle that, how to identify it, how to talk to your children. And then also, when you're facing a very large, potentially large, unbudgeted expense, the indemnification to make you whole. And it's the same with scammers. What we were talking about before. They have so much of our information already from breaches that have occurred and from what we share online that they can basically build a profile just to target you. And these are, that is, I think, what I'm seeing in terms of the shift of focus and concern coming out of more of our partners.
All right, thank you. So that was, I think, a really good introduction into really what's going on in the world of cyber, the challenges therein. As we were preparing for the session, I was talking with Jeff, and I mentioned, it's like, okay, I'm the oldest one in this group, but back when I was in college, we thought nothing of sharing our social security number. It was my driver's license number. It was my student ID number. And, it's like, wow, what a different world we live in today. Folks now who weren't around back when I was, I guess, probably don't have any idea that information was that publicly available at that point in time. And there's probably still little nuggets of that remaining out there to be discovered by somebody with bad intent. So we're going to shift gears a little bit now, and floods seem to be in the news regularly, whether it's runoff during spring thaw in the Midwest or storm surge from a Gulf hurricane. would seem logical that awareness of the peril should generate action. But Serena, are homeowners taking note, and are they understanding their own exposure?
Hi, thanks, John. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly flooding is something that must be weighing on the minds of a lot of people more recently. Certainly living here in the Northeast, I recently was just dealing with, the Hurricane Ida that came through. So I think we had a lot of people that were caught off guard, that experienced flooding, that maybe never experienced flooding before. I think one of the biggest issues that we see when it comes to flooding is that there's a very large protection gap in the United States when it comes to flooding. So some estimates are as low as 5% of households purchase flood insurance. So there's a lot of misconception when it comes to flood. I think that has led to, this very low take-up rate. Similar to, on the cyber front, I think flood is something that a lot of people think won't happen to them. In addition to that, I think that some homeowners might believe that flood is covered under their homeowner's policy. And oftentimes they won't find out that a flood loss isn't covered until they've experienced a loss. So I certainly think, with the rise of, number of flooding events and impacting areas where there maybe hasn't been historical flooding, people are really starting to understand a little bit more about their risk of flood and that it can happen in these areas. Also, I think, the fact that the NFIP right now holds the majority of flood insurance policies, and just the idea of the mandatory flood purchase requirements has led to kind of a binary thinking, where people really think of this as, if you're not in a special flood hazard area, you don't need to purchase flood insurance. But I think, what we've seen is truly all homes are vulnerable to flooding. So certainly I think, after we see really large events like this, things like Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Ida, we start to see an uptick in interest following those events. But we also have, a little bit of a problem where people start to have short-term memories when it comes to flooding events. So maybe that starts to increase. But then if they go through a period of time where they don't have a flood loss, they may cancel that policy. I also think that the availability of options is certainly helping people as well. So now we have, the private market is starting to grow. So I think there's a lot more information coming to homeowners right now when it comes to ways to protect their homes against flood.
All right. Yeah, terrific. I mean, if there are things out there that are starting to pique the interest of the consumers and really better understand the risk, that's fantastic. I know, I can't tell you how many folks I've talked with who really don't perceive there to be any risk unless they have to have flood insurance to get their mortgage secured. So let's talk a little bit about, the NFIP's new risk rating 2.0. When I saw that they were doing this, I'll say finally, I thought, okay, fantastic. And this has got to help the market overall. It's got to build a lot more awareness. Has that really done anything in terms of building awareness, aside from building awareness that if you live on the coast, your flood insurance is going to cost more?
Sure. So, I certainly think that there's a lot to be seen when it comes to risk rating 2.0. So that methodology is just now put in place for new policies that are being written starting on October 1st. Of course, any existing policies that are eligible for renewal can immediately take advantage of any decreased premium. And then the remainder of the policies renewing after April 1st would be moved into the new rating methodology. But I think overall, the impact of risk rating 2.0 will help to raise the awareness with homeowners, primarily because it's focused on your risk appropriate pricing. So that kind of goes back to what I was saying before, where we have, the special flood hazard areas. We have a lot of subsidization going on where higher value properties maybe along the coast, are paying a lower premium than some lower, some properties that are more inland. So I feel like people really aren't getting a true sense of what their risk is when you have premium that's subsidized. So risk rating 2.0 is definitely going to give a little bit more transparency there. And I think the result is going to be that homeowners are going to better understand their risk when they see what that true risk appropriate premium is for them. That current methodology, the current methodology up until now had been in place for a number of years. So it was certainly I think time for for that to take place. We have a lot of capability now to better predict flooding. So I think incorporating all of this into the NFIP is really going to help the market as a whole to grow over the next couple years.
All right, terrific. So let's talk a little bit about insurers and what you're seeing there. So it does seem like more companies are venturing into flood, either a full-blown flood program such as an NFIP substitute kind of program, or on a limited basis such as inland flood. I know that you're seeing interest in it. What's really driving that? Is that coming from demand from consumers? Is that coming from I'm not going to say speculative opportunity, but are they seeing the opportunity there in advance of the demand, or is it all coming together at the right time?
Sure, I think there's a lot of factors that are really going into that. I think first and foremost is the availability of those flood models. So I think there was definitely some hesitancy in the past, from private insurers to move into that flood space. But now we have really advanced flood models that can do, a much better job of predicting flood loss, so that we can get, we can charge that appropriate premium. We also see a lot of reinsurers in the space that are willing to, take on some of that risk, to partner with private insurers to, offer various flood products. Another big thing that's really led to the private market increase is the acceptance of private flood insurance from lenders. And then lastly, I would say that, we also have a number of states that are actively encouraging a private market. So some of the steps that they're taking is making it easier for private insurers to enter that flood space. And some of those actions would be that, the DOI is waiving the need for insurers to get prior approval on rates. So they're better able to, I think, respond to any changes that need to be made when it comes to pricing. So all of that is just, that more robust flood market is offering a lot more opportunities, I think, for people to kind of get into that space and feel more comfortable offering the coverage.
All right, terrific. It's interesting. One of the, I mentioned at the outset the survey that we did with our personal lines folks, and one of the questions we asked them is what would be at the absolute bottom of their list? What would they not want to venture into? And a pretty good number of them said that NFIP substitute. And I don't know if they were looking at that as just something with the same limitations as the NFIP program, or kind of something competing with broader coverage and all the things that the consumers actually need. I suspect they're looking at that more limited program that they didn't see a lot of opportunity for. All right.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add on, John, and say that, I agree. From the private market, we're not just seeing replacements for the NFIP coverage. I think we're seeing a lot of companies that are going into this space looking at lower hazard, low to moderate risk, and offering lower limits for flood insurance. So certainly, flood is not a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. I think, private insurers are developing really, specific types of coverages that can benefit homeowners, no matter where they're located, not just for people who are on the coast.
All right, terrific. Thank you. All right, now we're gonna bounce over to Matt and talk a little bit about fire. And this summer, we once again saw a tremendous number of acres burned in the western U.S. We know these large wildfire events get tremendous attention, but does a typical homeowner have a good understanding of their own fire risk?
Thanks, John. Thanks for the invitation to participate on this panel. So, so fire is an interesting phenomenon, and we've seen it make the news quite a bit this year, and again with the focus predominantly in the California market and the West Coast, and we all tend to focus on the acreage of the fires, and particularly nowadays with terminology like gigafires and megafires. We're starting to see a real emphasis on how large the fires are, but really in many cases, it's really the location of the fire. A 500-acre wildfire that's right next to protected property is far more significant in many cases than a 500,000-acre fire that is not necessarily directly near protected property, what have you. So sometimes the acreage is sort of a bit of a red herring here, but yeah, so we are seeing a whole lot of attention, and frankly, it's in many cases long overdue attention. But in doing so and bringing all this attention to the wildfire space, it creates this perception, maybe even misperception, that the greatest exposure for fire is around catastrophic wildfires. And obviously, they are a significant driver of loss in wildfire-prone areas, and particularly in what's called the wild and urban interface, or WUI. But it sort of obscures perhaps the more traditional bread and butter fires that we see that are affecting communities and properties across the country. And so it creates this kind of perception in terms of that well, if I don't live in a wildfire-prone area, which I would actually argue that most people don't realize they live in a wildfire-prone area, but actually in many cases do, because in fact, there's virtually no part of the U.S. That is not wildfire-prone or has not had a significant wildfire. We saw a wildfire, a pretty significant one in Hawaii this year. We see them in the boundary waters of kind of the Great Lakes area. We see them in New England. We see them down like in Florida. We see them in the Appalachian region. Wildfires and brush fires, grass fires, whatever we term them, really affect all parts of the country. But ultimately, again, there's a focus again around wildfire, but which is important. And again, we really need to. There's a lot to be gained there in terms of reducing that risk, but also there's a really significant need and opportunity to reduce reduce non-cat fire risk. What we might think of as the traditional bread and butter structure fires. Well, they may not be as significant. They may not garner as much national attention. Those are still a pretty significant driver of loss for many insurers, and particularly for the insureds who experience those fires. They are particularly devastating. And so there's a real opportunity to focus on terms of reducing non-cat fires as well. And it's a kind of persistent driver of loss, and that's really something. There's perhaps a need to kind of refocus on that as a significant peril, and that's kind of somewhere where we're kind of focusing our efforts.
All right, terrific. And while I'm thinking about it, since I have not done this yet in this session, I want to make sure that our audience out there knows that we will be taking live questions. So please, if you have any questions for us, feel free to submit those questions now. And we do intend to get to those questions at the end of the session. Okay, and Matt, you kind of talked a little bit about this issue already, but fire. Well, when we look at the issues we're talking about today: cyber, flood, and fire. So cyber, relatively new exposure, and in insurance terms, it's a very new exposure. Flood, literally been around forever. As a peril, it's been around as long as there's been insurance. But still, oftentimes consumers don't understand it's not covered in a standard homeowners program. Fire, on the other hand, it's included in the program. It's been there literally from the beginning. So what is the big awareness challenge? It's not a coverage issue, I don't believe. what's the big awareness challenge that we face with fire?
Yeah, great question. And that's, I mean, when you're coverage A, when you're the kind of the original peril, you might say, it becomes a challenge to try to how do you maintain attention to it, because there are so many other other perils and kind of increasingly nuanced perils that are going for kind of like competing for attention. And so and because it was kind of the original peril in the sense that it was always just assumed, well, we're going to have to cover it. And so it kind of has not been the primary focus for a lot of entities. And there's a lot of historical assumptions that go into how we look at fire. And so as we try to figure out how to, in a sense, put fire back front and center, there's a real opportunity to kind of reframe how we look at fire. And because part of that is, as I may have alluded to earlier, that fire is a persistent driver of loss, particularly non-cat fires. Year over year, we still see fire losses still creeping up, and so there's a real opportunity to really start to kind of chip away at that. But it's not something we're going to be able to do by ourselves. And there's a lot of other efforts that are going on, and there's a lot of information that's out there that we really need to have access to start to understand what does fire exposure look like in the communities that you're covering, and particularly the properties that you're covering. And so there's a real opportunity to try to reimagine how we look at this, because again, sometimes when you're kind of you're early to the party, sometimes it's easy to get overlooked. And so there's a real opportunity now to take a broader look at it and to go back up to some of the original assumptions and start kind of to challenge them in some cases.
All right, so what are the leading causes of fire in the home, and how can insurers help to build awareness?
Yeah, thanks. So consistently year over year, the kitchen fires and fires kind of originate in the kitchen, cooking fires and what have you. They tend to be pretty significant in terms of the number of incidents that occur every year, and so. And so there's a lot of work that's going on trying to reduce the likelihood of kitchen fires. There's some technical work that's going into reducing that exposure in terms of trying to sometimes in the fire industry is referred to as the 5 E's. So one of those is engineering. So there's some work going on to try to reduce the likelihood of kitchen fires by engineering out the fire problem. So there's things like smart burner technology that's going into trying to reduce particularly for electric stoves, trying to reduce the temperature at which the coil heats up to make so you can still cook your meal and boil water just as fast, but doing so in a way that's not as likely to like through some of their studies, not less likely to actually create fire conditions. And there's also a real key part around education, which is one of the other E's. And so there's a lot of work going on in local communities across the country trying to reduce kitchen fires. And through that's like education, there's kind of concepts and messaging around things like stand by your pan, kind of a takeoff of that old song. But and there's a lot of efforts in terms of trying to drill down into the ways in which basically who's more likely to have kitchen fires, and there's trying to work and trying to reach out to those communities and those homeowners to try to make sure that they're getting that message, because the traditional approach of just broad-based messaging on billboards and kind of PSA announcements wasn't nearly as effective. And so there's a lot of efforts going on kind of at local level to try to start reducing those types of fires. And then of course there's wildfires, but that's a whole nother story.
Stand by your pan.
Mm-hmm.
I think the AAIS band can pick that one up. I thought it was interesting. We were looking at some fire loss data based on time of day, back working on flames at one point. And it's like, as insurers, we tend to look at a vacant home as being, something that you really worry about. And from a fire perspective, it's like, it seems like more when the house is vacant all during the day, people would come home from work, light up the stove. That's when the fire department starts getting calls to respond. So it's like, yeah, all right, vacancy might not be such a bad issue after all.
There's a silver lining there.
All right. So again, remind everybody, go ahead and submit your questions that you've got for us. We'll be happy to dive into those at the end. We kind of talked in the first part of this session, we've really focused on really awareness. What are the perils? What do homeowners understand their risk to be? And how do we maybe help a little bit with that? Let's explore that a little bit farther and talk more about mitigation at this point in time. So Matt, fire loss mitigation is oftentimes talked about. Generally, when I've seen it, it's been in the context of that big blaze, burning multiple acres and protecting your home from wildfire. That's certainly not, that's certainly important, but that's certainly not the only issue, as you've been talking about. It's really the more routine stuff. So how do we help out? What do you see as the biggest opportunities for fire loss mitigation?
Sure, absolutely. And yeah, to your point, there's a lot of important conversations going on around wildfire risk reduction and risk mitigation. And there's a lot of work about trying to identify those actions that homeowners can take. And that's really probably the biggest takeaway here is that it's really trying to, that fire protection, the fire experience in fire protection was kind of, for a long time was looked at as something that occurred to homeowners. That if they had a fire, it was kind of, there wasn't a whole lot they could do about it. They just needed to get out of the house and kind of hopefully the fire department got there quickly. The same thing for wildfires, kind of like, well, if you're just in a wildfire prone area that you just kind of were stuck in a position where there's not much you can do about it. We're starting to see a real transformation in that approach. And we're starting to see a lot more awareness among homeowners and among communities and among local authorities in terms of what can actually be done to try to tackle this. So around wildfire, as we said, there's a lot of conversations around there, but around like non-cat fire losses, there's a tremendous amount of effort going on and a tremendous amount of activities going on in the local communities right now. The fire departments across the country, of which there's approximately 30,000 different fire departments in the US, they are actively doing different fire mitigation efforts. In fact, just last week was Fire Prevention Week, and so many fire departments ramp up their public education campaigns and their risk mitigation efforts kind of to correspond with that. But what we're not seeing, though, is we're not seeing the data and the information about those activities. And that's really where the opportunity lies, is that there's a tremendous amount of work being done to date. We just don't actually know where is occurring or what's, and so it makes it hard to actually be able to kind of quantify what is the impact of those fire prevention activities. Are there some that are more effective and more beneficial in terms of reducing exposure and reducing loss versus others? Right now, it's quite difficult to say that with any sort of conclusive evidence because we're just not seeing that information and data on a regular basis. So.
All right, terrific. And Serena, what do you think are the biggest opportunities for flood loss mitigation?
Sure. So I think when we talk about flood loss, I kind of want to look at it from both an individual perspective and then also from a community level or from a policy level. So, I mean, there's of course things that steps that homeowners can take to safeguard their homes from flooding. Some of those things, are looking at resilient building materials. So what are the construction methods that are being used when we're building homes? And what are those building materials? Those can have a large impact on whether or not a structure can withstand a flood. There's also, elevating buildings, above the base flood elevations, and then installing flood openings, on ground floors to allow that water to flow through. But I think more importantly is really the stuff that we see, from a community level. And, dealing with flood, I think it's much bigger than, individual properties. It has more to do with, the community and how we're looking at things like urban development and land use policies. So a lot of the reason we see, flooding in these areas that, we didn't have flooding before is because of all of the growth. All of the sprawl that we see, from cities outward, we're paving over surfaces. So water that, the way that the flood maps were, drawn before aren't taking into account all of these changes. So water needs somewhere to go. So, when we're building up, these communities, we need to make sure that that they're paying attention to how that land is being used and what impact that's going to have on how the water is going to move, throughout that community. I think also, from a community level, we're also talking about things like investing in infrastructure. So, one of the major flooding events that we saw last year was the dam failures in Michigan. So investing in infrastructure as well can also have a really big impact on mitigating flood losses.
All right, terrific. Thank you. And Jeff, what about cyber? Obviously, it's a different animal, but there still has to be a lot that homeowners can do to protect themselves from cyber loss.
Yeah, homeowners do have a lot of options for protection when it comes to cyber, right? They can purchase all sorts of things, consumer products, anti-malware, backup storage, password managers, all of those tools help. I think it's the main reason you've started to see a lot of those tools packaged alongside personal cyber endorsements, because these tools, coupled with educational resources, make a big difference in the mitigation of loss. And really one of the biggest parts of mitigation for cyber is awareness and its education, right? These simple practices can go a long way. It's stuff that sounds very simple, but behaviorally we forget a lot about. Don't use the same password, or change your password, particularly after you get a breach notice. Don't click the random links in your email. Even if it looks real, you should be careful. Update your devices. And, it's really the simple stuff, right? It's don't share your information. I know, John, when we started this conversation, we were saying, you're amazed at how much people will share online, right? It's, nobody actually wants to know the name of your first dog or your third grade teacher on Facebook. It's just a really great way to get the answer to the security question when I hit the forgot password button. And unfortunately, we're all too accustomed to filling these things out and putting all of our information out there. But just being a little careful, or, I don't want to say the word paranoid, but be a little paranoid with all of the information you're putting out there, links that you click and things like that.
Productively paranoid.
Yeah. Maybe careful is a better word.
All right, terrific. And, kind of changing this around a little bit. So Jeff, what can insurers do to help their customers avoid losses or recover more quickly after the fact?
Yeah, I think the most important step would be to provide the appropriate cover for cyber. Begin the conversion from identity theft to these full family cyber coverage endorsements. And frankly, to a degree, that's going to take care of so much of this for you, because the tools, the services, the indemnification that follows with that is going to help the insured avoid losses and help them recover from losses, right? It's doing the things that they don't necessarily know to do, and also providing the indemnification for the loss if it gets that far. So frankly, I think the most important thing you can do is offer the coverage, because the coverage is the awareness to a certain extent.
Terrific. Thank you. Serena, what about flood? What can insurers do to help their customers avoid losses or recover more quickly after the fact?
Yeah, I agree. I think the biggest thing is really educating on the coverage. So, when it comes to flood, since it's not covered under, the standard homeowners policy, when someone has a loss, it's going to be it could be pretty devastating. Of course, there's FEMA emergency assistance that's out there, but that really isn't going to be enough to fully recover from a loss. That's not what it's designed for. So I think the biggest role that insurers can play right now is educating homeowners as to the risk, and then giving them options as to how can they protect their homes. And then I think the next thing there is really, once we have that coverage on there, is getting the payments out quickly. That's something that the private market, I think, can leverage really well as we start to see the number of private carriers writing flood increases. Insurers have CAT management plans in place that, to assess damage and issue payments following those types of large events. So really what helps people get back on their feet is to get those payments so that they can, start to clean up and start to rebuild following a flood loss.
Terrific. Thank you. And Matt, what can insurers do to help their customers avoid losses or recover more quickly after a fire?
Sure. So there's quite a bit of work going on in terms of, and there's a lot of effort to try to quantify some of the various different and frankly recognize the various different fire mitigation efforts. We're seeing a lot of this in the wildfire space right now. There are groups and projects such as FireWise communities, where the communities are engaging in kind of coordinated and kind of evidence-based work to try to basically reduce the amount of fuel, which is the flammable brush that might be around their homes. And so and there's a whole kind of recognition program around there. So we're seeing more and more carriers that are providing recognition for that, and then perhaps reductions in premium for that. And so we're also seeing for a long time we've seen recognition of smoke alarms and other alarm systems. The big question there sometimes is are those smoke alarms up to date? Have they been smoke alarms typically have a 10-year lifespan, and so we're starting to see more and more carriers that are actually asking those questions, perhaps in a bit more nuanced way, to make sure that the smoke alarm that are in the home are actually effective, and they have batteries in them. And so we're seeing a lot more effort around trying to recognize and incentivize fire mitigation efforts, whether it be kind of for wildfire or kind of structure fire as well.
And that's a really great point, because it's not just a point in time thing. You don't just do it once and forget about it, and that's certainly going to be the same, for Jeff talked about passwords. Get them updated. Don't leave the same password out there for 5 years. And look for, not look for anything. Go ahead and make those changes when it's appropriate to do it. So I got a question or two here. So we're going to move on to that. And this first question was submitted in advance, and it was really around fire, but I'm going to expand this to also include flood in it, because I think it's all relevant. So Matt and Serena, the question is, do you feel climate change is the primary contributing factor for the increases in wildfire severity in the Western U.S.? And Serena, just kind of tack on to that, certainly flood activity, hurricanes in the Gulf, so on and so forth. A lot of things are being kind of attributed to climate change. So I'd kind of like to hear your perspective, each of you on your respective perils.
Sure. So while the focus on wildfire and climate change is pretty significant, as the losses for wildfires have increased over the past, particularly the past 4 seasons. If you kind of discount 2019 season, which was kind of a welcomed reprieve. And so there's been a lot of attention on climate change, and it's certainly a key contributor. And particularly, it's a contributor in the way, in the kind of the way it manifests itself is kind of through some of the more established things that have relationship, kind of environmental factors have a relationship with wildfire, namely the kind of ongoing and persistent drought we're facing across the western part of the U.S. Also, there's a lot of, like in terms of the more extreme temperatures, both the higher highs and the drier, kind of drier weather that goes with that, and also some of the lower lows, because then we get kind of the more kind of extreme experience in terms of, in some cases, when it's really cold, you get a lot of snowpack, but then turns into very abundant foliage downstream of that. And so, so it's certainly having an impact. But I think as sometimes, again, unfortunately, the topic of climate change gets a little politicized and people have very strong opinions of it. But it's the key factor here is that climate change is only one of the major impacts that's going on. And so we really need to also consider that, that there's also, for the past basically 100 years, the kind of federal wildfire policy and kind of the states have kind of adopted a very similar approach has been predominantly around suppression. And so we've really focused on reducing and basically excluding wildfire of all forms, including what's sometimes increasingly known now as good fire, from our forest. And so by removing as much and trying to aggressively put out and otherwise known as suppress wildfires, we've had the unintended consequences of increasing the amount of fuel in our forests and our various communities. And so that's certainly a pretty significant impact as well. And then also for the past, let's say about 40 years or so, we've seen pretty dramatic changes in land use patterns, and particularly the growth in the wildland-urban interface. And so we've seen houses, and particularly in the key part here, and the key kind of going back to the whole thing around mitigation, is houses that were not designed to be wildfire resilient. And so that weren't designed with mitigation built in. We're building those further and further into either the forest or other places that are particularly wildfire prone. So it's hard to segregate one particular risk factor, but I really think it's an important kind of, we need to think of this kind of holistically. And ultimately, again, it comes back to wildfire is just a part of the environment. It always has been, since long before people were here in the environment, and it's going to continue to be. And so we just need to figure out how to live better with wildfire. And there's a lot of focus so it kind of rightly puts the focus back on wildfire mitigation. So that's I think that's really where kind of climate change comes in.
Perfect, thanks. And Serena?
Yeah, I mean, I think climate change, very clearly does have an impact. When we look at flooding and number of events that we're seeing and severity, just looking over the last, 5 years, we've had 9 separate billion-dollar flooding events that have occurred in the United States. So that average number per year has continued to go up. Over the, since 1980. So we are certainly seeing more severe storms, higher losses over time. And when we look at, what Matt was saying about, increase in temperatures, things like that. So warmer atmospheres are better able to hold water. So for every 1 degree Celsius change in temperature, the atmosphere can hold 5 to 6% more moisture. So we're seeing a lot of these really heavy rainfall patterns now, that are associated with storms. John, you also mentioned that increasing frequency of hurricanes. So just even thinking of 2020, we had 30 named hurricanes, 30 named storms. 12 of those made landfall in the United States. So all of this is going to have a really big impact when it comes to flooding. Another statistic that I've seen here is that storms have also started to slow down. So that's a lot of the problem as well. So when we look at events like Hurricane Harvey, a lot of that flooding was caused by the fact that system stalled over the Houston area. So it just dropped a lot of rain over a really short time period without kind of moving on. So storms have become slower over, the last 50 years or so. So ultimately, I think, the result of climate change is, we're seeing a shift from flood risk away from the coast. So hurricanes generally, being thought of as wind surge events. But as we kind of see, the changes coming, with climate change, we're seeing more flooding events, more of these larger storms that are staying, that are moving slower and just bringing a lot more rain to areas.
All right. Terrific. Thank you. And we've got time for just one more question here. So I'll go to, got a couple to choose from. That's great. So one last one here. So Jeff, question for you. Are insurers or reinsurers finding avenues to pursue the bad actors who profit from cybercrime?
A good question. I don't think so. I don't think that that's necessarily the goal of the insurer reinsurer. I think certainly it's more so about focusing on the customer, getting them back up to speed, either from a system compromise type attempt and, getting their system running properly again, or paying the ransom in a ransomware event. I think what you've seen, though, is more interaction with law enforcement and insureds in these events, right? The FBI has been very vocal about ransomware. Please reach out to them. They're urging victims, I should say, to reach out to them in the event of a ransomware attack, so they can, look at it, get some information, see how they can help. I think there's more collaboration going on that end rather than, kind of the pursuit of a bad actor by an insurance company or something like that.
All right. Well, on that, we are at the end of our time, and I want to thank Serena, Jeff, and Matt for helping out with this session. I thought it was very informative, and I hope our audience members did as well.